Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out how people live. Today we're going to venture a few miles south of Saint-Remy de Provence to the remains of a medieval castle called Les Baux de Provence. The area was known to Roman legionaries who swarmed into the area in the 2nd century BCE, but it was only during the Middle Ages that the area was truly fortified by the lords of Baux. Today the castle site remains mostly dismantled but secured. Sometimes a site like this is recognized, restored, and becomes a linchpin of economic development for an entire area, as did Carcassonne, which we visited a few weeks ago. Other times, and this is what happened here, the site benefits from the economic development outside of the castle itself. Today we're going to concentrate on the castle remains, which will give you a good idea of just what was required and remains essential for any defensive area to this day. Come on a trip to the mountaintop with me, the armchair traveler, as your guide. Historical preservation can be a difficult and tricky proposition, but done properly it is always expensive. I'm sorry to report that what remains of the castle that was once the linchpin of this area is not enough to carry itself, much less the village and the surrounding area. Les Baux de Provence, however, is far more than a hilltop castle, although the castle once was the linchpin of development for the entire area. The castle was deliberately destroyed by King Louis XIII in 1632. The France we know today had only begun to emerge then, and there was considerable local resistance to the powers in the north. The powerful lords of Baux, who we will meet in a few minutes, were independent and had no interest in giving up their power and authority to a higher lord in Paris who offered very little to them in return. Later on, the castle became a stronghold for Protestant rebels during the Wars of Religion. Cardinal Richelieu, Louis's chief minister, saw this as a threat and ordered the demolition of the castle to prevent further rebellion. Then and now, a castle is far more than just its keep or stronghold. Usually there's a village outside the walls where the people who worked in or provided food and services to the castle lived. Today, in many ways, the ruins are just a minor attraction and part of what I think of as a concerted effort to redevelop this entire area. The tiny village you see here is classified as one of the most beautiful villages in France, but the commune and the area nearby have other attractions and they are easily accessible from all over the south of France. For example, the nearest airport is Avignon, less than half an hour by car, and Avignon itself is only about an hour by train. However, for a very long time after the castle was dismantled, this area was essentially economically dead. Unlike Carcassonne, which we visited earlier in our tour, Les Baux de Provence wasn't saved and rehabilitated by the French government. No historian or architect took up its cause, and it remained in a state of deliberate destruction until well into the 20th century, although the walls have since been stabilized and some work has been done to document the site. The castle area itself, however, looks about the same as it did the day after Cardinal Richelieu's men tore it down. By the end of World War II, the nearby village was essentially as dead as the castle. That's when revival of the area began. The rebirth may have been generated by the arrival of a Catalan painter, engraver, and typographer named Louis Jou. Jou wasn't French. He was born near Barcelona. At age 16, he joined a group of young intellectuals and artists and ultimately moved to Paris, where he became a typographer, engraver, and book illustrator. Jou set up a print shop here in the village, and he had friends who visited him. Among them were Pablo Casal, a Catalan cellist and musical conductor, Pierre Ségur, a poet and World War II resistance fighter, André Suarez, another poet and writer, and Yves Brieur. These men, although perhaps only temporary residents during the summer, gave the village a reputation of being something of an intellectual and artistic haven. Havens are no good without places for guests to stay, tarry, and spend their money. In the early 1950s, Les Baux became an essential gastronomic stage thanks to an ambitious restaurant called the Houstot de Beaumanière. Today that restaurant, and it rates 3 Michelin stars, includes not just the restaurant but a winery, a guest house, and a spa. Clearly, people with money, pull, and power were interested. In 1966, André Malraux, then Minister of Culture, registered the entire commune, it's kind of like a county, under the protection of the Ministry of Culture and Environment. The city then committed to a period of rehabilitation that established its ranking as one of the most beautiful villages in France back in 1998, and a remarkable heritage site as recently as 2019. Even an abandoned limestone quarry made it into the action as a multimedia art museum. All of these things contributed to the resurrection of the building and surrounding site, which had essentially been abandoned. The ruins on the top of the hill that started it all were all that remained. The Habitat de Treme shown here certainly didn't look like much to my eye, just a cave-like structure in a limestone rock. I would have guessed it was natural, but academics think it was what's called a troglodytic or cave-based structure, carved into the cliffs, perhaps into a natural cave. Over the centuries, this was used as a shelter, a dwelling, and possibly even a hermitage for rogue monks. There's no way of telling who chiseled the hole into the limestone or when. The sign called it the home of the Tremea, and a bit of research told me that Tremea is linked to something called the Rock of the Tremea, a nearby carved rock that shows three figures. The carving is sometimes associated with the Romans, but its origins and purpose remain a mystery. Some theories suggest it might have represented a Gallo-Roman deity or an early Christian depiction Holy Family. From what I could see, it didn't look particularly Roman, but what do I know? Another more likely interpretation suggests that the carving dates back only to the Middle Ages and represents a knightly or noble couple. And given the strength and prominence of the local lords, I think that might be a pretty good explanation. Unlike many of our other stops, Les Baux cannot be said to have had more than a glancing relationship to the Romans who conquered and occupied the province. The Celto-Ligurian tribes who lived here were part of the same tribe that occupied the entire area. Les Baux, with its naturally defensible plateau, would have been an ideal stronghold for them, and possibly for the Romans. The Salians were known for resisting Roman expansion until they were decisively defeated by the Romans in 124 BCE, and the eventual Romanization of the region began. Roman military forces were well-trained, equipped, and clever, but most of the time, for example in the 1st century BCE, or about a century after forces first ventured into Gaul, the area was occupied by somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 legionaries, all that was necessary to occupy and administer the area. They picked strategic locations, generally quite close to planned or existing road, and Les Baux de Provence, while a nice defensible rock, simply didn't make the cut. The origins of the chateau or castle we see today date back to about the 10th century, when the lords of Baux, a powerful feudal family, ruled the region. The family found itself a nice high rock and built itself a castle. The fortress was strategically important, standing on a natural rock formation some 600 feet above the valley, making it nearly impenetrable by any enemies. We don't have much definite information about the family, except that the first we know of was called one Pons Juvenis, which might have meant something like Pontius the Younger. Was he a Romanized Gaul? Was he a Greek trader? All we have is the family lore, in which they claim to be descendants of Balthasar, one of the three wise men, which gave them the divine right to rule. Their shield, shown here, is meant to represent the Star of Bethlehem. Under the powerful lords of Baux, thick limestone walls were carved directly out of the rock. Other parts, things like towers, were built out of the limestone that had already been excavated. The castle was designed to be self-sufficient if ever it were besieged. The lords of Baux waged war on pretty much everyone, near or far, and reportedly may have traipsed as far as Albania. They never recognized the authority of the French kings and emperors to the north. By the 12th and 13th century, the lords claimed 79 towns and villages in Provence, as far north as Avignon. They ruled here until the 15th century, when the family died out, and the domain eventually came under the control of the French crown. Even then, however, local nobles engaged in resistance to the king. The castle proper, as you can see on the map, is actually quite small and occupies only a small part of the hilltop. A village grew up nearby on the side of the hill, outside the castle, but secured with its own walls. This is the last remaining gateway into the village. The heirs of the Baux family got themselves into real trouble. They saw fit to resist King Louis XIII, and after their revolt was put down, Louis XIII ordered his cardinal, Richelieu, shown here, to destroy the place. It does not seem to look much different today from the day after Richelieu and the king's men did the deed. I mentioned that the fortress sits on top of a mostly empty tabletop area. It can be quite cold and windy. For the ruling nobility, winter in Les Baux would have been a time of relative leisure indoor with occasional feasts and entertainment, but that didn't mean it was very comfortable. For ordinary people, it was something to be endured. Ensuring that food supplies and water were available until spring, they had to brave the elements as well. Winter on this exposed tabletop would have been harsh and uncomfortable, especially when the winds blew through the cliffs. I visited in mid-May, and as you can see, I had to bundle up. Les Baux is a medieval construction, and the people who fund and manage it today need to attract paying visitors. They've added activities and attractions designed to draw not just tourists like me, but local and visiting families looking for a day in the countryside. In the summer months, they put on a medieval show every weekend. Among the displays are catapults. These are replicas of medieval siege engines. You can even try your hand at crossbow shooting, and there are demonstrations of jousting. However, those displays only last from about May until October. The rest of the year is much quieter. The castle's isolated location gave it a good start toward being easily defensible. But the family also put in defensive walls, either carved into or out of native limestone, and towers. This is what's called the Saracen Tower, which was built to protect the southern side of the castle. It got its name from the Saracens, a term used in medieval Europe to refer to Muslim peoples, particularly those from North Africa and the Middle East. During the Middle Ages, Provence and other parts of southern France were frequently raided by Saracen pirates and armies. The name likely reflects a historical connection to a Saracen raid in the region, or simply follows the medieval tradition of attributing fortified structures to the Saracens, even when they were not directly the cause or even involved in the local construction. The donjon, or keep, was perhaps the most important part of any castle. It might be one room, or later on, a series of rooms stacked one on top of another in a tower. The keep was usually set in or near the center of the castle grounds, possibly inside what might have been the original wall of the castle. Often, with different terrain, a keep might be partially defended with a moat or a river, but that was impossible here. In its day, the keep might have looked something like this artist's interpretation. I was surprised not to find any paintings or engravings of the site. This is where the lords and ladies of Les Baux lived. To build it, the rock was largely hollowed out. The stones were therefore available, ready to be carved at a time when many castles were still being built out of wood. The entire area is mostly limestone, but getting stone from off-site quarries would have been a difficult and expensive proposition. What better notion than to use what was already at hand? On the first level, the donjon probably only had one room, most likely eventually housing the lord's soldiers and their weapons. Upstairs, on what we'd call the second floor, there were 3 rooms, and there may have been a third floor. At the beginning of the 15th century, the keep was still inhabited, since the last princess of Baux, Alex, died in the great chamber of the tower. The latter was then a fairly rich affair with furniture, tapestries, and chests, jewels, silverware, and family papers. All of that has long since disappeared. Very few people could have lived in the keep or donjon. Ordinary people who staffed and serviced the castle would have lived outside the castle in the village, but the ancient inhabitants left another alternative: cave homes. The area around Les Baux de Provence was once covered by a vast shallow sea during the Mesozoic era, between 100 and 66 million years ago. This ancient sea left behind a thick deposit of limestone, which later formed the striking cliffs and rocky landscapes seen all over this part of modern France. Limestone has a habit of harboring caves. The stone is relatively soft and easy to dig and carve, at least compared with something like basalt or granite. Prehistoric dwellers probably found these caves, added some kind of door to close them off, and moved in. Over time, enterprising residents might have carved them out to make them larger and more comfortable. Later on, during the Middle Ages, these troglodytic homes, the word troglodytic here just means cave-like, were expanded and incorporated into the larger structures of the fortress, including the chateau. The soft rock made it easy to dig out at living spaces and also provided natural insulation, keeping the area a bit cooler in summer and a bit warmer in winter. Many troglodytic homes were later expanded with built-in stone facades, giving them the appearance of being traditional masonry homes. You can see in this photo the remains of what might have been a kitchen cabinet, as well as a much later window, now glassed in, and what I took to be a modern bench for tired sightseers like me. Water management is absolutely vital in castles. A castle like this one is relatively easy to defend, but its location also makes it a trap. If an enemy can cut off supplies of food, water, and ammunition, the defenders eventually can be starved into submission. A castle sited on top of a hilltop like this one is unlikely to have spring water available, but its inhabitants and builders had options. This is a rainwater capture field. It's a little difficult to make out in my photograph, but it isn't natural rock. These are pavers, rough cut into the natural stone. Over 1,000 years or so, the crevices have filled in with enough dirt to support these poppies. The captured rainwater was channeled into cisterns like this one. Today, this is a rose garden, but in the Middle Ages, the people who lived here depended on it. There were a couple of others just like it for drinking water. The castle also needed a way to drain runoff from its streets. What you see here, beside this ambling tourist, is a channel for draining rainwater and sewage. We know that people living outside the castle and around this hill grew grain and brought it uphill to grind it in the owner's mill. They didn't actually have much choice. In the 17th century, one of the lords ordered all of the local mills to be destroyed so that he had a monopoly. If you had grain and wanted to grind it, you used his gristmill. This mostly destroyed structure showed what the gristmill looks like today. There was no water to power these wheels. They were wind-powered. The artist's impression shows what the castle mills would have looked like when in use. In a medieval castle, the bakery was a vital structure, ensuring a steady supply of food, especially during sieges when outside resources could be cut off. The bread produced here would probably have been fairly simple, made out of wheat or barley, depending on what was available. Like so much else on the site, the bakery was built into and out of the native rock. Now in ruins, the main feature of the bakery was an enormous bread oven carved directly into the rock. There was also space for the bakers to prepare the dough. Originally, the oven house, as it is called, apparently had 2 floors. You can still see traces of a staircase above the front door. Fresh meat, or even preserved salted meat, in the Middle Ages was not only rare but very expensive. Birds filled in the gap, but not the chickens we rely on today. Keeping doves was a privilege of the nobility in medieval France, and dovecotes were often symbols of wealth and power. When I first saw these tiny cave-like structures, I thought they looked like mailboxes, and in a way they are. These are dovecotes. We know that the builders and inhabitants of the castle had access to fresh drinking water and bread. They still needed meat, something that could be raised right here on site, and doves were it. The birds were especially popular during the Middle Ages for their meat, eggs, and fertilizer, and today you can still find dovecotes dotted all around France. The rock dove, the species is called Columba livia, was common in medieval Europe, and is actually the ancestor of the modern wild pigeons we find in cities and farms across America today. Medieval doves would have looked a lot like modern pigeons, grayish with iridescent feathers on their necks, although selective breeding has led to more color variations in the present time. The main difference is that those rock doves were domesticated. They were raised in dovecotes and fed a special diet of grain, seeds, and plants. Their controlled diet and the fact that they weren't allowed to fly led to tender, succulent, flavorful meat. Modern feral pigeons, on the other hand, eat a diet of whatever they can scavenge, often including garbage, bread, even discarded fast food. This and the fact that they fly all the time affects their muscle composition, making them extremely tough, and taste, often giving the meat a gamey, unpleasant flavor. I had exposure to barbecued pigeon once as a child up back on the farm, and I promise you, it was inedible. Even my dog, Judy, turned up her nose at it. And with that, defenses, places to live, food in the form of bread and meat, and a fresh water supply, we have it. The bare essentials of any fortress or castle, and how life developed inside and outside the defended area. Castles were generally centers of economic development, as this one was in the Middle Ages. Centuries later, the economically developed area, in this case the medieval village and surrounding area, is returning the favor. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France, not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser-known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on-the-ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up, other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog, a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.